The city moved at its usual hurried pace, horns blaring, footsteps pounding against the concrete, and voices blending into a chorus of impatience. Yet in the middle of all this noise was a woman who seemed invisible to most. Her name was Clara Jennings. She was a janitor at the downtown train terminal, the kind of job that people walked past without ever noticing. Every day, she pushed her squeaky cart across marble floors, mopped away the footprints of strangers, and emptied bins stuffed with the remnants of lives too busy to see her. To others, she was simply background noise, but to Clara, survival depended on every hour she worked. That morning had begun like countless others. She had woken up before dawn in her tiny rented room, the walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing. A cracked window let in the chill, but she had grown used to shivering through her mornings. With weary hands, she packed the same plain sandwich into a brown paper bag, tucked her faded uniform into her bag, and walked the 10 blocks to the station. There was no bus fare to spare. Each step was a reminder of the bills stacked on her dresser at home, the kind she tried not to think about. The doctors had warned her that exhaustion and untreated stress could eat away at a person's health. But Clara couldn't afford to stop working. Rest, for her, was a luxury. As she bent over to scrub a stubborn stain from the floor tiles, her chest burned with a dull ache. She pressed a hand there and closed her eyes for a moment, telling herself it was nothing, that she just needed air. Then she pushed the thought away, the way she always did. She had learned to ignore her own pain, because if she paid attention to it, she might collapse, and collapsing meant no paycheck. No paycheck meant hunger. So she straightened her back and kept working. By mid-morning, the train station pulsed with life. Travelers hurried with rolling suitcases, vendors called out to passing crowds, and the screens flickered with rival times. Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and glanced out toward the main entrance. That's when she noticed him. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped through the revolving doors, moving with the air of someone who was accustomed to being noticed, even from a distance. Clara could sense the weight of his presence. His polished shoes, his crisp jacket, the gleam of an expensive watch at his wrist. He was the kind of person who seemed untouchable, wrapped in a life of success that people like Clara could only dream about. His name was Daniel Whitmore, though Clara didn't know that yet. To the city, he was a millionaire investor, the type of man who could shift entire markets with a single decision. Articles were written about him, interviews filmed, awards given. He lived in a world of skyscrapers and boardrooms, a world Clara never thought she'd step into. Their paths should never have crossed. But life has a way of bending the rules when it decides to write a story. Daniel moved quickly across the station, a phone pressed against his ear, his voice sharp, commanding. Close the deal before noon. No excuses, he barked, weaving through the crowd without looking up. His eyes darted to the screen above him, checking the time, then back to the path ahead. People made way for him instinctively, as though his very presence demanded it. But suddenly, something in his stride faltered. He paused, hand gripping the side of a bench. His phone slipped slightly from his ear as his breathing quickened. For the first time, there was a crack in the armor. Clara noticed it before anyone else did. She had a habit of seeing things others overlooked, a half-finished cup left behind, a child's toy forgotten on the floor, the flicker of discomfort across a stranger's face. As Daniel steadied himself against the bench, his complexion paled, his lips pressed tightly together. Then, without warning, his phone slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor. He crumpled to his knees, gasping, one hand clawing at his chest. The crowd froze. People glanced over, startled, but no one moved. Some turned their heads, others whispered to one another. A man muttered, someone should call for help, but didn't take his phone out. Time slowed, stretching out like an eternity. Daniel's breaths grew shorter, his eyes wide with fear. For all his wealth, for all his power, at that moment, he was just another human being on the edge of life slipping away. Clara dropped her mop and ran. Her worn-out sneakers slapped against the tiles as she pushed through the circle of onlookers, who had gathered but stayed frozen. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling but steady enough to lift his head. "Sir, stay with me," she urged, her voice firm. "You're going to be okay." His eyes flickered toward her, confusion mingling with desperation. To him, she must have looked like a blur, just a woman in a faded uniform. But in that instant, she was the only one who had chosen to act. She shouted at the crowd, "Call an ambulance." Now a few startled voices echoed back, but still, people hesitated, unsure. Clara reached for his phone, lying cracked on the floor, but it had gone dark, so she yelled again, louder this time, her voice cutting through the noise of the station. Finally, someone fumbled for their phone and dialed. Daniel's hand twitched against hers. His breaths were ragged, shallow. Clara adjusted his posture, loosening his tie, trying to keep his airway clear. "Don't close your eyes," she said, her voice softening. "Look at me. You're not alone." Something about her tone pierced through his panic, and his gaze locked onto hers. In that moment, it didn't matter that one of them scrubbed floors while the other signed million-dollar contracts. What mattered was life, fragile and fleeting, and the desperate fight to hold onto it. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, weaving through the chaos of the city's streets. Clara didn't move from his side, even as sweat rolled down her temple and her knees ached from the hard floor. She whispered words she hoped he could hear. "You're strong. Just hang on a little longer. Help is almost here." And as the paramedics burst through the station doors, rushing toward them, Daniel's grip on her hand tightened ever so slightly, as if, in those final moments of consciousness, he had placed his trust in the one person who refused to walk away. Clara didn't know it then, but this moment, this choice to act when no one else would, was about to change not only his life, but hers in ways she could never have imagined. The sharp command of the paramedics filled the air as they rushed toward Clara and the man sprawled at her side. Their presence cut through the paralysis of the crowd, who quickly stepped back, creating a path. Clara let go of his hand only long enough to give the responders space, but she stayed kneeling, unwilling to leave his side. One of the paramedics leaned down, checked his pulse, and began barking instructions. A portable oxygen mask appeared. Wires were connected, and in less than a minute, Daniel was strapped to a stretcher. Through it all, his gaze wavered, flickering in and out of consciousness. But every so often his eyes seemed to search for her face, as if he didn't want to lose the only anchor he had found in that chaos. "You came in at the right time," one of the medics muttered to Clara as they lifted him. "You might have saved his life." The words washed over her, strange and heavy, but before she could respond, they were already pushing the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance. Something inside her stirred, something she couldn't quite name, but it pulled her feet into motion. Almost without thinking, she followed. The doors of the ambulance slammed shut, and for a moment Clara stood outside, her chest rising and falling with uncertainty. She was just a janitor, after all. What place did she have in the unfolding emergency of a wealthy man's life? Yet as she turned to walk back into the station, something gnawed at her. She had looked into his eyes, had seen fear flicker there, and she couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now would be abandoning more than just a stranger. Against every logical thought, she whispered to herself, "I can't just walk away." And with that, she hurried to the nearest cab and told the driver to follow the ambulance. The ride seemed endless, the city blurring past in streaks of gray and glass. Clara's hands twisted together in her lap as her thoughts raced. What if he didn't survive? What if her small act had been nothing more than a pause before the inevitable? But then she thought of his hand gripping hers, faint but deliberate, as though he had chosen her in that moment when his world tilted into darkness. That thought carried her all the way to the hospital doors. Inside, the sterile brightness of the emergency ward felt like another planet. Nurses moved swiftly, doctors called for scans, machines beeped in urgent rhythms. Clara lingered near the entrance, clutching her bag, unsure whether she had the right to stay. She was about to turn back when a nurse approached. "Were you with the patient when he collapsed?" the nurse asked briskly. Clara nodded. "Then stay close. We may need details." With that, she was ushered into a small waiting area, her presence suddenly given a strange kind of importance. Hours passed like years. Clara sat stiffly in the plastic chair, her sandwich still untouched in her bag, her mind replaying the moment over and over again. Around her, families clutched each other, Children whimpered. A television played muted news in the corner. She was surrounded by stories, each one heavy with its own private storm. But her thoughts remained tethered to the man she barely knew. She realized she didn't even know his name. At last, a doctor appeared. His expression was calm, professional. "He's stable for now," he announced to a group that had gathered. Clara watched as a pair of well-dressed assistants hurried forward. Their voices filled with relief. "Mr. Whitmore will be transferred to intensive care for monitoring," the doctor continued. "He'll need rest and observation." Clara froze at the sound of the name. Whitmore. She had read that name in headlines, seen it scrolling across financial reports on store televisions. Daniel Whitmore, a man whose life seemed galaxies away from hers. The assistants turned, whispering. Quickly, then one of them spotted Clara. "Were you the one who helped him?" he asked, his tone cautious but curious. Clara nodded, feeling suddenly small under their sharp suits and polished shoes. "Mr. Whitmore owes you thanks," the man added, though his eyes quickly darted elsewhere, as though already calculating the next task. They disappeared down the hallway, leaving Clara with more questions than answers. She should have left then. Her shift had already been missed, her paycheck at risk, her life waiting outside those hospital walls. But something pinned her to the chair. Maybe it was the quiet echo of his breathing when she had knelt beside him. Maybe it was the way the world had looked at her differently for one brief moment, not as invisible, but as necessary. So she stayed. The night deepened. The waiting room emptied and refilled, faces changing with the passing hours. Clara dozed lightly, her head against the wall, until the sound of footsteps roused her. A nurse approached again. "He's asking for the woman who helped him," she said softly. Clara blinked in surprise, then followed her down the long corridor. The air smelled of antiseptic, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors echoed faintly as she entered the dimly lit room. Daniel lay propped against white pillows, his skin pale, but his eyes open. Tubes and wires surrounded him, a stark reminder of how fragile even the strongest lives could become. When his gaze found hers, something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, recognition, perhaps even disbelief that the woman in the faded uniform from the train station was standing here, in the quiet sanctuary of recovery. "You," his voice rasped, strained but certain. "You didn't leave." Clara's throat tightened, but she managed a small smile. "No," she said gently, "I stayed." His eyes softened, and for the first time, the commanding edge that had defined him in the station was gone. He looked not like a millionaire, not like a man untouchable, but simply human, fragile, grateful, and alive. Clara pulled the chair closer to his bedside, unsure what to say next. But perhaps words weren't needed. The silence that stretched between them wasn't empty. It was full of meaning neither of them could yet name. For Daniel, it was the dawning realization that life could slip away faster than any deal he had ever made. For Clara, it was the quiet awakening that sometimes the smallest act of courage could echo louder than years of unnoticed struggle. Neither of them knew then how deeply this night would bind their lives together, how the act of saving and being saved would ripple far beyond this room. But the seed had been planted, and with it, the beginning of something neither had dared to imagine. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a soft reminder that life had chosen to stay a little longer with Daniel Whitmore. He lay back against the pillows, his breathing more even now, though each inhale seemed to carry the weight of memories he had tried hard to bury beneath years of success. Clara sat beside him in silence, her presence quiet but unwavering, like a candle in the corner of a darkened room. Every so often, his eyes drifted toward her, and though words sat heavy in his throat, none seemed strong enough to cross the space between them. For a man who had once commanded boardrooms, silence was an unfamiliar struggle. As the night stretched on, sleep refused to come. Instead, Daniel's mind wandered, unspooling the long road that had led him here. He remembered being a boy in a cramped apartment, the son of a mechanic who worked with grease-stained hands and a mother who took in laundry to keep the lights on. Back then, money wasn't just paper. It was the difference between dinner or hunger, warmth or cold. He had promised himself as a child that he would never again feel powerless. that he would climb so high no one could push him down, and he had done it. He had studied until his eyes burned, clawed his way into the best schools, and turned his hunger into ambition sharp enough to cut through every obstacle. Success had become his armor, wealth his shield. But somewhere along the way, the boy who had once dreamed simply of security had been swallowed by the man who measured life in numbers and deals. He thought of the skyscrapers, the penthouse view that stretched over the glittering city, the staff who answered to him, the endless phone calls that dictated his days from the outside. It was a life others envied, a dream painted in gold. But lying there in that hospital bed, Daniel realized how hollow it had begun to feel. He could summon an empire with a signature, yet not a single one of those signatures had been there when his chest tightened and his knees buckled on the station floor. No contract had reached out a hand. No deal had told him to keep breathing. Only her, only the janitor no one else saw. His gaze shifted to Clara again. She sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the floor as though she were trying not to intrude. But her very presence unsettled something in him. Why had she stayed? She owed him nothing. Most would have walked away once the sirens arrived. Yet here she was, a woman who had nothing to gain, sitting in the stillness of the night beside a man whose life looked nothing like hers. Gratitude swelled in him, but beneath it, there was also an ease. He had spent years surrounded by people who came close, only when there was something to take. Was she different? Or had he grown too suspicious to see truth when it sat plainly in front of him? Clara, too, wrestled with thoughts she didn't voice. She shifted in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her, but something in her heart anchored her to that bedside. She had seen enough of the world to know that people like him lived in realms she'd never touch. But the image of him collapsing in the station had shattered that distance. In those terrifying minutes, he had been just a man gasping for air. And she had been the one to hold him steady. That memory lingered in her chest, refusing to let her leave, though she knew every minute here meant lost wages and heavier bills. Still, something inside whispered that some moments were more important than survival. That maybe this was one of them. When dawn crept in through the blinds, painting the room in soft gray light, Daniel stirred. His voice was rough but deliberate. When he finally spoke, "You didn't tell me your name." Clara blinked, startled. "Clara," she said softly. "Clara Jennings." He let the name settle in the air. "Clara," he repeated, almost as though trying to anchor himself to it. "You saved me." She shook her head quickly, almost embarrassed. "The paramedics saved you. I just didn't walk away." His lips curved into the faintest of smiles, weary but genuine. "Sometimes, not walking away is the hardest thing." The words caught her off guard, lingering in her mind even after silence returned. She wondered if he knew how closely they mirrored her own life. How many times she had wanted to walk away from the endless grind of survival but hadn't. Because giving up was not an option. They came from different worlds, yet in that sentence, it felt like he had reached across the divide and touched something familiar in her. Later that morning, his assistants arrived again, their polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. They carried phones, folders, and urgency. Their voices clipped as they updated him on business matters. Daniel listened briefly, then raised a hand. "Not now," he said, his tone quiet but firm. The assistants froze, exchanging surprised glances. Daniel Whitmore never said not now. Work had always been his lifeblood. Yet lying there with Clara in the room, he realized how absurd it was to return to the language of profits and contracts. When he had only just clawed his way back from the brink, the assistants retreated, confusion on their faces, and for the first time, Clara saw the faintest crack in the image of the untouchable millionaire as the door closed. Daniel turned back to her. "I don't know why you stayed," he said honestly, "but I'm glad you did." Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "Maybe because no one else did," she whispered. Her words struck him harder than she intended, echoing in the quiet room. For a man surrounded by people his entire life, it was startling to realize how few had been willing to be there when it mattered most. The bond between them was fragile, like the first threads of dawn unraveling the night. But it was there, undeniable. Neither of them could yet name what it would become. or how far it would stretch beyond this hospital room, but both felt it, a pull neither had expected, a reminder that sometimes the most life-changing connections are born not in moments of triumph, but in moments of weakness when the world has stripped away every mask. Outside, the city roared on, blind to the story beginning within these walls, but inside, two lives, once separated by class, wealth, and circumstance, had begun to brush against each other in ways that neither could ignore. Clara rose to leave, knowing she couldn't stay forever, but as she reached the doorway, Daniel's voice called her back. "Will you come again?" he asked, almost cautiously. She paused, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes, I'll come back." What neither of them realized was that this promise, small as it seemed, was the spark that would set both their lives on a course neither had imagined, a course filled with trials, revelations, and choices that would test everything they believed about themselves and about each other. The hospital had a way of swallowing time, bending hours into something unrecognizable. For Clara, returning to see Daniel after her long night at work felt like stepping into a story she didn't quite belong in. She had mopped the floors of the terminal that morning as if nothing had changed, the same faces rushing past her, the same dull ache in her shoulders, but something inside was different. When she pushed open the hospital door and found him sitting up, dressed in a clean hospital gown, with sunlight spilling across the sheets, she realized that she was stepping into a space that had started to tether itself to her life. Daniel looked up when she entered, and though his features were composed, there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You came back," he said simply, as though he had spent the morning waiting to see if she would. Clara nodded, setting her small bag on the chair. "I told you I would." For a man who had lived surrounded by power, it startled him how much weight he gave to those few words. Promises in his world were usually bound by contracts, sealed with signatures, and broken when convenient. But Clara's voice carried none of that. It was plain, steady, and somehow more binding than anything he had known. They spoke little at first. Clara wasn't used to conversation with men like him, and Daniel was still learning how to speak without the sharpness of command. Yet slowly, piece by piece, they began to fill the silence. Clara told him about her work at the station, the long hours, the way most people never even noticed she existed. Daniel listened, really listened, and for the first time in years he realized how much he had forgotten about ordinary lives. Lives like the one he had come from before he climbed beyond it. In turn, Daniel shared fragments of his past, though he chose his words carefully. He told her about long nights of study as a young man, about the hunger that had pushed him forward, about the relentless pursuit of something greater. He left out the lavish details, the penthouse, the empire, perhaps afraid that speaking them aloud might remind her of the canyon between them. But Clara didn't press. She wasn't there for the shine of his wealth. Her eyes carried no greed, only curiosity, as if she were searching not for the millionaire, but for the man beneath the titles. Still, the worlds outside this room refused to stay silent. One afternoon, when Clara arrived, she found a woman in a sleek black dress standing near Daniel's bed, her posture sharp, her voice low but urgent. "You can't disappear like this," the woman said, glancing at her watch. "The board is restless. Investors are asking questions. Your absence isn't just noticed, it's dangerous." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Tell them I'll return when I'm ready, not before." The woman pressed her lips together, clearly unused to defiance. When her eyes fell on Clara, a flicker of disdain crossed her face, so brief yet sharp enough to sting. She gave a curt nod and swept past, heels clicking against the linoleum. Clara stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly aware of the gulf between her thrift store jacket and the woman's polished elegance. She stepped inside slowly, unsure if she had intruded on something far larger than she was meant to witness. Daniel's gaze softened when he saw her. "Don't mind her," he said, trying to brush away the tension. But Clara couldn't ignore the reminder that his life was tangled with things she could hardly imagine. She settled into the chair, though the weight of that woman's stare lingered in her mind. The days passed, and with each visit, the fragile thread between Clara and Daniel grew stronger. Yet Clara felt it pressing against the edges of her own world. Her supervisor had noticed her absences. Bills stacked higher on her dresser. The cough that had shadowed her for months grew sharper, more insistent, but she swallowed it down, unwilling to bring weakness into the one space where she felt seen. She never told Daniel. He had enough battles of his own. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Clara entered the hospital to find Daniel waiting more alert than usual, his hair combed neatly, a faint color returning to his cheeks. He looked at her with a seriousness that caught her off guard. "Clara," he said, "I want to thank you properly. You gave me something I can never repay." She shook her head quickly. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone would have done." But Daniel's voice sharpened with emotion. "No," he said firmly. "Anyone didn't. Do you understand? There were dozens of people in that station, and not one moved. Not one. But you did. You saw me when no one else did." His words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Clara looked down, her hands twisting together. "I just couldn't let you die." He studied her, his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with illness. For the first time, he saw not just the woman who had saved him, but the quiet strength she carried, strength born from battles no one had ever written headlines about. And he realized that she was teaching him something his empire never had, the kind of courage that doesn't come from wealth or power, but from refusing to turn away when it matters most. That night, as Clara prepared to leave, Daniel spoke again, softer this time. "Clara, when I leave this place, my life is going to pull me back into a storm. But I don't want to lose whatever this is between us. Will you let me see you again?" Outside of here, her heart stumbled. The question was simple, but the world behind it was not. She thought of her rented room, her aching body, her empty wallet. She thought of the suits, the boardrooms, the woman in black with her cold stare. Two worlds so far apart that they barely touched, and yet, standing there in the dim glow of the hospital hallway, she felt the quiet possibility of something extraordinary, something that defied logic. "I don't know if I belong in your world," she whispered. Daniel's eyes held hers, steady and unwavering. "Then maybe it's time my world changes." The words struck her like a spark in the dark. She didn't answer, not yet, but as she walked away, her heart carried the weight of them. Echoing long after she stepped into the night air, neither of them knew what storms awaited, or how deeply their lives would be tested once the hospital walls released them. But both felt it, the beginning of a crossing, fragile but unstoppable, like two rivers about to collide. The day Daniel left the hospital. Cameras flashed outside the doors, reporters shouting questions, their microphones thrust forward like spears. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed, watching as the man she had known only in quiet hospital rooms was swept back into the storm of his world. Assistants rushed to his side, shielding him from questions, guiding him toward the black car waiting at the curb. His steps were steady but slower than before, his face calm but unreadable. Just before the tinted door closed, his eyes flicked through the chaos and found hers. It was only a moment, but it was enough, a silent promise that what had grown between them in those fragile nights wasn't forgotten. Clara turned away before anyone could see her, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The city had no cameras for her, no assistants to guide her home. She walked the long blocks back to her rented room, the soles of her shoes thin against the pavement. The silence of her space swallowed her whole when she stepped inside. Bills still waited on the dresser, her cough rattled in her chest, and the sandwich from the morning still sat in her bag. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She sat on the edge of her bed and closed her eyes, remembering his words, "Maybe it's time my world changes." They echoed like a secret vow one she didn't dare believe too deeply in, and yet couldn't let go. For Daniel, returning to his empire was like stepping into a storm that had been gathering in his absence. Meetings stacked against one another, contracts waiting for his signature, faces lined with expectation and pressure. His assistant rattled off numbers as he slid into the leather chair. At the head of the gleaming conference table, screens lit up with charts and figures, voices filled the room, but none of it felt the same. He found himself distracted by the memory of a janitor's voice urging him to keep breathing, of hands that had steadied him when the world blurred into nothing. He had built his life around numbers, yet none of them carried the weight of her presence in that hospital room. His colleagues noticed the shift. He was quieter, more measured, his gaze wandering in moments that once would have held unbroken focus. "You need to reassure the board," one of them pressed, leaning forward. "They're worried your health will affect confidence." Daniel's jaw tightened. "My health won't decide the market. My decisions will." His tone silenced the room, but even as he spoke, he knew something had shifted. He no longer believed his decisions were the only ones that mattered. That evening, after the endless parade of meetings, Daniel sat alone in his penthouse. The city stretched beneath him, glittering, alive. Yet the silence of the room pressed heavily against his chest. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected his own face back at him, but for the first time, he saw more than just the powerful man the world knew. He saw the fragility of the moment he had nearly lost it all, the fear in his own eyes when life threatened to leave him, and the woman who had refused to walk away. The emptiness of the polished marble floors and the silence of expensive furniture screamed louder than the noise of the city. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hesitating only a moment before dialing a number. He had asked one of his assistants to find. Clara answered cautiously, her voice soft and uncertain. "Hello, it's me," Daniel said. "I didn't want the hospital to be the last place I saw you." There was a pause on the line, a silence filled with questions she didn't ask. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" "Because you remind me of something I've forgotten," he admitted. "What it means to be human, to need someone, to see someone." His words stumbled, unpolished, unlike the ones he usually wielded with precision. But they were honest. Clara's chest tightened. Part of her wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that their lives were too far apart to intertwine. Another part wanted to hold on to the warmth his voice carried. "Daniel," she said softly, "your world and mine, they don't match." "Then maybe we don't need them to," he replied. The line fell into silence again, both of them, holding words they couldn't yet speak. Finally, Clara said she had to go, promising she'd think about meeting him. When she hung up, she pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes, her cough rising again until she bent forward, gasping. She pressed a hand against her lips, willing the sound to fade, unwilling to let him hear the weakness that stalked her. Days turned into weeks. Daniel kept reaching out, sometimes through calls, sometimes through quiet messages. Clara kept her distance at first, afraid of being pulled into a life she didn't belong in. But slowly, she agreed to meet him in places far from his empire, where no cameras followed. They walked along quiet streets at dusk, shared simple meals in small diners where no one recognized him, spoke of childhood memories and hidden fears. Daniel found himself laughing in ways he hadn't in years, while Clara discovered that behind the armor of wealth, he carried scars not unlike her own, scars of loss, fear, and longing for something real. Yet shadows followed them. For Clara, every night she coughed harder, her strength fading. She hid it, burying her sickness behind practiced smiles, unwilling to let him see how fragile her own body had become. For Daniel, whispers of disapproval grew louder. The woman from the hospital returned, sharper than before. "She doesn't belong in your world," she warned. "If you let this continue, you'll lose everything you've built." Daniel's response was steady. "Then maybe everything I've built isn't worth as much as I thought." But when he was alone, he battled his own doubts. Could he really protect her from the world that would never understand? Could he bridge the gap between their lives without crushing her beneath its weight? And what if she didn't want to be saved? For Clara, the question was different, but just as heavy. Could she allow herself to lean on someone like him when she could barely carry her own burdens? Or would letting him in mean exposing the illness she had worked so hard to hide? The choices loomed like storms on the horizon, inevitable and dangerous. And yet, each time they met, each time their eyes lingered on each other a little longer, neither could step away. They had been drawn together by chance, by a single moment in a crowded station. But what held them now was far stronger. Something, both terrifying and undeniable. One night, after another long walk. Daniel stopped her on the corner of a quiet street. The lamplight framed her face, soft and weary, but beautiful in its honesty. "Clara," he said, his voice low but certain, "I don't want to imagine a life without you in it." Her heart clenched. Torn between longing and fear, she opened her mouth to speak, but her chest tightened, and before she could stop it, a violent cough escaped her. Daniel's hand moved instantly to her back, concern flashing in his eyes. Clara straightened quickly, forcing a smile, trying to wave it off. "It's nothing," she whispered, but the look on his face told her he knew it was more, and in that moment, Clara realized the truth she had been avoiding for so long. The secret she could no longer hide was about to come to light. Clara walked home that night with the weight of his words pressing against her heart like a secret she could barely hold. The lamplight had faded into the distance, but Daniel's face lingered in her mind. Not the polished, untouchable executive the world admired, but the man whose hand had steadied her as she coughed, whose eyes had searched hers with something raw and unguarded. She pressed her coat tighter around her, her steps uneven, every breath rattling like a whisper of warning. She wanted to believe in what was growing between them, but she could no longer ignore the truth clawing at her lungs. Her body was running out of time. The days that followed blurred into a cycle of hiding and pretending. At the diner where she worked extra shifts, she smiled for customers, cleaned tables, and carried trays as though nothing was wrong. At night, she lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, her cough tearing through the silence, her hand pressed hard against her chest to keep the pain from echoing too loud. She told herself she could handle it, that Daniel didn't need to know, that she wouldn't burden him with something he couldn't fix. He lived in a world of solutions and control, but there were some battles money couldn't win. Daniel, however, had already begun to sense the storm. Each time they met, he noticed the faint tremor in her hands when she lifted a glass, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought he wasn't looking, the brightness in her eyes dimming faster with each day. His concern grew, and with it, a determination he hadn't felt before. For years, his life had been about numbers, deals, empires, things that could be won and measured. But Clara wasn't a contract to close or a problem to solve. She was a person who had reminded him what it meant to be alive, and he wasn't willing to lose her. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the last streaks of sunset burn across the sky, Daniel turned to her. "Clara," he said softly, "I need you to tell me the truth. What's happening to you?" Her hands tightened in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a shaky breath, she whispered, "I've been sick for a while. The kind of sick that doesn't just disappear with rest. I didn't want you to know, because I don't want it to be your responsibility." The words tore through him like glass. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "You're not my responsibility. You're my choice, and I won't stand by while you fight this alone." Her eyes brimmed with tears she had fought for months to hold back. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. Daniel, people like me, we don't get rescued. We fight until we can't anymore. That's just how it is." His grip only tightened. "Then let me fight with you. Maybe I can't change the past, but I refuse to let your future slip away without a battle." Clara turned toward him, her heart torn between fear and hope. For the first time in years, someone wasn't just looking at her, they were seeing her, all of her, the fragile and the strong, the weary and the brave. And that terrified her as much as it comforted her. The days ahead became a test of both their worlds colliding. Daniel used every resource he had, connecting her with doctors, specialists, treatments she never imagined could be within her reach. Clara resisted at first, ashamed of needing help, but slowly she allowed herself to lean on him, to believe that maybe she was worth the effort. In those sterile hospital rooms where she now sat as a patient instead of a visitor, he stayed by her side, not as a businessman, but as a man who refused to walk away. But with every step forward, new obstacles rose. His world whispered against her, voices warning him of distraction, of risk, of scandal. "She's not the future of this company," one board member hissed behind closed doors. "You can't tie your life to someone who doesn't belong." Daniel listened, his jaw set, his silence louder than any argument. Later that night, he told Clara the truth. "They think I should let you go," he said. "But they don't understand. Without you, none of this matters." Clara stared at him, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything you've worked for." He shook his head. "You already are the reason I found something worth keeping." And yet, the fight wasn't easy. Clara's illness grew heavier before it got better. There were nights she thought she wouldn't see the morning, nights when she begged him to leave and save himself from the pain of watching her fade. But Daniel stayed, holding her hand through every fever, every tremor, every dark hour when hope felt thinned out. One night, as the city lights glowed faintly beyond the hospital window, Clara whispered through labored breaths, "Why are you still here?" Daniel leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Because when you pulled me back from the edge, you didn't ask why. You just fought for me. Now it's my turn." Her tears slipped silently onto the pillow, not from weakness, but from the fierce realization that she was no longer alone in a battle she had always fought by herself. As weeks stretched on, Clara began to feel moments of strength return, fragile, fleeting, but real. The doctors spoke of new possibilities, of treatments working better than expected. Daniel celebrated each small victory as though it were a mountain conquered. He walked beside her through recovery, never rushing, never demanding, just holding space for her to rise on her own. And as she grew stronger, so did the bond between them. It was no longer just about survival. It was about life, about building, something neither of them had dared to dream. In the quiet of her small apartment, they spoke of futures they once thought impossible. She imagined teaching again. He imagined stepping back from the empire to live differently. They laughed at the thought of what the world would say, but neither cared. Still, one question lingered in Clara's mind, unspoken but heavy when the world came to test them again. And it would their fragile, beautiful connection survive, or would the weight of expectation, illness, and doubt tear them apart before they truly began? The answer waited just beyond the horizon, where the next chapter of their lives stood ready to unfold, not with certainty, but with the kind of courage that only grows in the face of fear.